What do you think that the current wave of strike action means for the labour movement?
So that's a really big question. I'll try and sort of answer it in brief, and hopefully we'll be able to dig down into it a bit further. I think first of all, it means that people are really angry at the sort of multiple crises that we're experiencing and the way that that is sort of cashed out in our daily lives. Angry about how wages have been falling for decades, really, but especially over the last decade of Tory misrule. Angry at how social housing hasn't been built in many areas for years and years and years. Angry at the increasing prices of energy, of food, of rent, of the cost of living in general. And I think for the trade union movement, this is a really important moment because that anger that people are feeling is starting to sort of turn into action, and it's starting to be expressed in political terms, perhaps in ways that we've not seen for a very, very long time. I think another thing that's really important from the labour movement's perspective is that we're seeing a real sort of like snowball effect. We're seeing trade unions, particularly like the RMT and the CWU in particular, but looking across the movement in general to my union, Unite as well, we're seeing a demonstration effect where people are seeing strike action, in the news, on the streets, in their workplaces often, in a really big way, in a way that we haven't seen for many, many years. And I think this all presents, a great many opportunities for the movement that we can't afford to let up. I think we have the chance to show real active and increasingly political leadership, bringing together the different strands of the campaigns against the rising cost of living, whether that's in our homes against rising rent, whether that's in our workplaces against falling wages and worsening conditions, or whether that's against the sort of rising cost of energy. I think the trade union movement has a real chance to bring all of those strands together and play a really obvious and prominent political role in a way that we haven't seen for many decades. And I think that's really, really exciting.
So obviously, you part of your political activity comes from the trade union movement, but also you are a Green Party member, an activist, and the Green Party's trade union liaison officer. So why do you think that Greens should be supporting unions and workers that are engaged in industrial action right now?
That's a good question. And I think there's a really simple answer to this, and then there's a more complicated answer. I think the simple answer is it's who we are. Greens, when we see injustice in society, when people come to us to ask for our help, to ask for our support, to ask for our solidarity, we respond in the affirmative. We get out with them, we stand with them, because it's the honest thing to do. And I think that's what people look to the Green Party for. They look to us for a clear voice against injustice wherever it pops up. They don't look to us to triangulate, to try and sort of get around things, or to refuse to be honest about where we stand. We need to be very clear that we stand on the side of workers, because it's why people join the Green Party, it's why people get involved, and it's why people vote for us as well. I think the more complicated answer to your question is actually really interesting. And I think it's something like this. We as Greens, as the Green Party and as the wider sort of climate justice movement, we need workers to win. We need to be building workers' confidence, both in their workplaces, on the streets, in our tenants' unions and so on and so forth. And we need to sort of build a confidence in sort of collective action more generally. That's absolutely critical. As Greens, we ask people to sort of take a leap of faith, to imagine that a better world is possible, and that it's not only possible but attainable if we all get together and we all work together to achieve it and to force that fundamental change from the government, to force fundamental changes in the system that currently governs us. That's an immense step to ask people to take. And I think we start getting people to the stage where they can place that trust in us by building confidence that people have in each other. And I think that starts by asking people to trust each other, by asking people to get together and say, we deserve better than this. And not only that, but we can get better than this if we all come together and get it. And I think that's the real power, particularly of sort of collective action in the workplace, where we spend, up to half of our waking lives, often more. I think that's the real power of it. And that's one of the reasons why it's so important for Greens to get behind this, because our success as a political movement depends on building that confidence that only trade unions can really achieve. And the other thing I'll just add before you come back in is that I think the trade union movement also needs political leadership right now. I said in answer to your first question that the movement has a real opportunity to bring together these different strands of anger that people are feeling at the crises that we're facing. And that's true. But I think we also need leadership on the political stage. We need a political party, a political movement that is prepared to stand with the trade union movement and say, no, this is right. This is good. This is what we need the government to be responding to. And we need the government to be listening. And most of all, we need a change in government right now. And we're clearly not going to get that from any of the other UK parliamentary parties. We're not going to get it from the Liberal Democrats, surely. We're definitely not getting it from the Labour Party right now, who seem desperate to avoid these questions. And when they do have to answer these questions, they generally say, oh, we have to be sort of, moderate. We have to avoid agreeing to workers' demands. We need a party that is prepared to stand with workers throughout this struggle until we win. And I think the Green Party is the only party that has shown that it's prepared to do that right now.
So there's already some questions coming in the chat. That's brilliant. Please do send more questions for Matthew, and we'll try and get to as many of them as possible. But before I come to the questions in the chat, one of the arguments that you've made previously, and it's one that I think is potentially contentious amongst some Greens, is that Greens should be supporting workers' struggles no matter what industry they're in, and defending jobs when workers are standing up and defending their jobs and their pay, even in polluting industries, Greens should be standing shoulder to shoulder with them. Say, for example, in the aviation industry. Why do you think that should be the case?
So if you don't mind, Chris, I'll sort of challenge the premise of your question a little bit. I don't think this is actually super contentious among Greens. I think when we get down to the heart of this issue, when we cut through all of the spin, when we cut through all of the sort of buzz around this, what it comes down to is that Greens think that workers deserve decent pay, fair conditions, and we don't think that people sort of stop deserving those things as soon as they happen to have worked in a socially harmful industry. The truth is that so much of our economy right now is socially harmful. Many of you listening, and I'll include myself in this, have worked for organisations in the past that aren't sort of perfect, and we don't do that because we necessarily believe 100% in what we're doing. We do it because we need to work to live, to survive. That's the fundamental sort of position we're in. So I don't think it is super contentious in that way, but I do think it is really important sort of to address the role that that workers in sort of environmentally harmful industries have to play in our movement. Because I think that they have a really, really important role to play. And I think it's important for us to point out that, axing pay, like cutting jobs or slashing pensions in the aviation industry, for example, won't keep a single plane out of the air. It won't keep a single drop of oil in the ground. It won't keep any CO2 out of the atmosphere. Over the past couple of decades, the number of jobs in total in aviation and surrounding industries has fallen, and yet the sort of the number of flight miles that we've seen has only continued to grow worldwide. So when we talk about sort of fighting the aviation industry and being prepared to sort of wind that down and transition to a more environmentally just future, we need to be very clear that our enemy is the aviation industry and not the workers in it. We should never confuse the workers in an industry for those who exploit them and who profit from them. And I think in the process of building a political coalition that can support and drive for a just transition, we need to be bringing workers in these industries into that coalition. They need to be at the very heart of it. After all, they're going to be most directly affected by any transition, but they also have the skills that we're going to need as a society if we want to start building the new industries that we want to see. Aviation workers, whether they're engineers, whether they're staff on the ground in airports, or whether they're staff, in the air, have immense skills, and it's only with their active participation that I think we're going to be able to successfully transition away from the polluting industries that we have now and towards something better.
What should solidarity with striking workers look like for Greens?
Yeah, I mean, this is a good question, and this is the golden question, because after all, you've asked several good questions, but it comes down to action. What are we going to do about this as a party? I think the first thing to say is that many Greens, many hundreds of Greens across the country are already doing this. Right, there are some great examples that we can point to. We can point to Councillor Jo Bird in the Wirral, who supported workers in her council in fighting for better pay and conditions. We can point to Councillor Zoe Garbutt in Hackney, who's worked closely with couriers in her ward and across Hackney in fighting for better working conditions in relation to the sort of food deliveries they make. There are so many examples that we can already point to. I think in terms of things that we want to be seeing more of, and I'll certainly be pushing for more of with the trade union group and in my position on the Green Party executive, I think we need this to get much, much bigger, and we think we need it to get much, much more coordinated. I want to see as sort of industrial disputes sort of continue to grow and to progress. I want to see Greens supporting trade unionists sort of on the street, using our leadership in communities, assisting with things like fundraising, like sort of practical support on the ground, the kinds of things that really do sustain strikes, to sustain sort of disputes over months and months and months, exactly the kind of thing that we're going to need to see, but that often falls beneath the radar. And I think we need to see that on a more sort of sustained basis. So what I'm going to be looking to do is to assist local and regional Green parties to start doing this in a more sort of substantial way, using the influence that we already have when we have councillors in council chambers, but also encouraging local parties who don't already have councillors to start doing some of that fundamental organising work to support, to fund, to sustain trade unions and striking workers as they continue in their struggles. And I think that's what it's going to look like. It's a very complicated picture. I don't think it's something that anyone can summarize in a few seconds or even a few minutes, but there's clearly a lot of work to be done. And I think we need it to be more coordinated than ever if we're going to provide that sort of political leadership that I talked about earlier.
Yeah, thank you, Matthew. So I'm going to take a couple of quick questions from the chat. I'm aware we've kept you longer than intended because of the late start, and I've got another guest joining at 10:45. So I'm just going to run through a couple of the ones that we've got come in. So this one has come in from Finn White. Thank you so much, Finn, for your question. So how do you think that the trade union movement can intersect with other movements like those for anti-racism and trans rights?
That's a really good question, and I don't claim any sort of special expertise on this, but I will give it a go. I think that the trade union movement has, I think in many respects, a really, really proud history, particularly in the past few years, past few decades of working with and working within movements against racism and against homophobia, transphobia, and all forms of discrimination. I think although the trade union movement often came to these things too late, it was, it should always have happened sooner. I think the trade union movement has nonetheless been sort of ahead of the curve in many respects, in sort of ultimately listening to those voices that needed to be listened to and taking the fight to discrimination. I think the trade union movement and the TUC across the board is, broadly speaking, sort of definitely ahead of the UK media and definitely ahead of the UK government in terms of supporting trans rights. I think that's really good, and I think that when we're fighting for those, those things within our own organisations like the Green Party, we should be pointing to the trade unions and saying, look, this is where the UK's workers, this is where the biggest civil society organisations in the UK, bar none, are, and we should be proud of that. I think it's really important for trade unions to be using their sort of active and increasingly visible role to support these movements. I think we need to make sure that our own trade unions don't sort of lapse into a more sort of conservative stance. When the UK's sort of right-wing media goes after anti-racist movements, when they go after campaigners for Black Lives, campaigners against police brutality and murder by the police, The trade unions shouldn't be quiet. In fact, we should be proudly in support of those movements, and we should be offering them practical support as well. After all, trade unions are some of the biggest and sort of often best equipped movements on the UK left, and they should be using those resources and that equipment to support movements that don't have all of those things already. And so I think those are some of the things that we can start to do as a movement.